Okay, are we ready? Okay, thank you everyone. I know it's been a long day, but I hope you still have some energy left. Let's go.
This is the story of a magical kingdom. One of wizards and warriors. It's an epic tale set upon the high seas. An odyssey through time and space.
It's also a bit of a winter wonderland bobsled sort of thing, you know? Oh, wait a minute. Did I mention the big explosion? Hold it right there. Look at these dolls. Almost forgot they used to be humans. Ay, ay, ay.
We sure cause a lot of explosions.
Okay, welcome everyone. So happy to see so many people joining us here today in Shanghai for this Wise Tour. Today has been the first time that developers from Hazelight have presented in China, so we're very, very happy to be able to join you, especially since we've been told that our recent games have become very popular here. The title of this session is The Two Listener Paradox, Mixing for Multiple Listeners in Wise, in which I will be able to give away some, maybe all of our tricks on how our team at Hazelight handles sound design and mix for a game that has multiple listeners. And in case you didn't know, Hazelight is a game development studio located in Stockholm, which is the capital of Sweden. And we are the makers of It Takes Two and Split Fiction, which was released earlier this year. And here's our in-house audio team, the fantastic team. Philip and Philip, you've already met just today. As you can see, we have a great group of developers that covers all aspects of game audio design, from programming to sound design to voiceover and to music. And before we go on to other topics, I thought that I would introduce myself. My name is Joakim Enigk Sjöberg, and my role is that of the technical sound design. And over the years, I've come to understand that this role is handled very differently just within different studios in Sweden. And I'm sure that it might be even more varied in comparison to similar roles in China. But on a most basic level, my role is divided between sound design and audio programming, which means that my day-to-day work will vary a lot depending on what currently is going on at the studio as a whole. But to give a few examples of what types of tasks I handle, first and foremost, obviously my most important job here is developing and maintaining our Wise integration into Unreal Engine 5, which is the game engine that we use at Hazelight. And secondly, I also do a lot of work to bridge the gap between that game engine and Reaper, which is our digital audio workstation. Sometimes I build tools and pipelines to help automate tasks, this sort of task that otherwise would take up a lot of time from other team members. So generally just doing as much as I can to make sure that the rest of the team is as efficient as possible in their work. Another big task in my role here at Hazelight is handling our tools for our motion capture recordings and that whole pipeline, which we do ourselves in-house in the studio. It is a lot of fun and it can look a little bit like this.
Oh, hi. Hey, where to?
Excuse me? Oh, great. We're going to the greenhouse.
We don't go there. Bad neighborhood.
They have no culture.
The purple crap had destroyed everything. The farthest we go is the garden fountain.
How much? Fixed price up front. 3 lave each.
You got yourself a
If
deal.
you've played It Takes Two, then maybe you can remember that scene, but I think it looks a little bit better in the final game. So to get ourselves started with the subject of this presentation, we start by aligning our understanding of the concept of a listener in game audio. So an object location with a location in 3D space that collects audio information. And I'm sure that most everyone here is used to the term spatialization. So the term that describes how a sound is perceived in a three-dimensional space relative to this listener. And by applying filters that are modulated by distance, directionality, and various types of environmental cues, we're able to imagine the nature of a sound in this space with very great accuracy. And today there exist many of these libraries and different applications that all have the capability of rendering audio in 3D space based on these industry set standards that have grown over time. And Wwise, of course, has everything a conventional game needs to handle these concepts. I guess the problem is that we don't really make conventional games at Hazelight. But in one of these conventional single-player games, we're at this point all very used to the concept of the single listener. One point of view through which all sounds in the game world will be heard. One truth. And we've spent decades experiencing 3D games in this manner. So there exists a lot of many behaviors that at this point in time, I believe both developers and players have come to expect from these sorts of games. But It Takes Two and Split Fiction are cooperative adventures. We have two players at all times. And this split screen introduces a second listener, which now also means that we have 2 points of audio reference. And that also means two competing truths. And all of these previously established rules that we've spent all these years getting used to, they're all now compromised. And sounds will no longer be coming from where we expect them to come from, which means that our understanding of the game world that we're experiencing falls apart very quickly. So an important understanding to have before we go deeper into this presentation is in how routing of sounds work in our split screen games. And I know that Philip touched on this earlier. We are not playing multiple instances of the same sound. We're playing one single instance that is routed to both listeners and then summed in the final system output. So this means that we will always have two separate mixing graphs with separate instances of all currently mixing buses. And additionally, in our case, this also means two separate HDR stages. And in this image you can see here, which is a fairly early setup from It Takes Two. And if you look closely, you might be able to make out the different shades of blue correlating to two separate HDR windows, which both of these will answer to one specific listener output. Quite interesting. So as a result of these two mixing graphs, in addition to all of these rules of spatialization starting to break down on us, we can also very quickly observe how distance attenuation starts behaving differently, as the volume of sounds will be different depending on if they're being heard by both listeners or just one. Mixing the game becomes absolutely impossible in this manner. So we had a lot of problems that we needed to find answers for before we could even really start making sounds back for It Takes Two. So when we were in that position, we needed to start on this journey. We first really needed to understand and make sense of what our challenges actually were. So first and foremost, a way to handle attenuation. All sounds needed to be able to be routed to both listeners at all times. And whilst doing so, attenuation behavior needed to stay transparent. regardless if that sound is currently being picked up by just one listener or by both. And secondly, for spatialization, we needed to be able to control it, make sense of it, and have that fine control over speaker distribution of our audio signals. Doing this meant that we would need to be able to combine two different camera perspectives in a way that was truthful to both playing experiences, and have that be summed through one shared output of speakers. And finally, for split fiction, we also had the added challenge that we gave ourselves of wanting to support new technology in 3D audio formats, such as Dolby Atmos, for instance. We managed to do so, but it was a big new task for us. So back in production for It Takes Two, to begin this work of solving these issues, we started by focusing on the attenuation problem and the problem of increase in amplitude. And once we really sat down to look at it, it became clear to us that what we heard was, of course, the result of a very expected audio phenomenon, namely that two duplicated signals will amplify one another. And you can easily simulate this behavior by yourself in Wwise by using an auxiliary bus to send a sound back into its own output bus. The result will be the same as doubling any audio signal, and it now plays 6 dB louder. Again, with this happening at runtime, mixing becomes impossible. And we would call this problem the 6 decibel problem. And it was, of course, a massive hurdle for us at the start of It Takes Two, because sounds would constantly be playing at different volumes. It would set the mix for an object one day, come back the next morning, and suddenly it's too loud or too quiet. So our first response was to implement a distance-based RTPC that would lower the output gain as the player got closer to the sound in order to counteract this natural increase of the now doubled signal. And this parameter had to be set from the game thread in Unreal Engine for every spatialized sound, for every single frame. This was, of course, a very ugly, very temporary fix to an issue that we really had no better way to handle at that time. And additionally, this only helped the problem of balancing volume levels, and it really didn't do anything to help with our issues in spatialization. Which leads us to the single biggest question to ever have faced the Hazelight audio team. This single question is something that the members of our team have discussed for the last years. Should the sound come from the left or from the right? Should it come from the front or from the rear? And all of these questions led us into many sort of philosophical discussions around what expectations we actually had when it comes to sound rendition in a split screen scenario. And over time, all of these ideas were cultivated and formed into a few audio design pillars that we've come to call the sonic real estate. The sonic real estate essentially describes the idea that both of our observers should be able to, at any time, claim their own personal space on screen, being allowed to immerse themselves in their own perspective without interference from the other player. In a normal split screen scenario like this, then that, they will probably get equal space on screen, but we have vastly varying scenarios where sometimes one player might be able to occupy more space than the other. And while we've only really talked about 3D spatialization up until now, it's very important to know that conventional 2D speaker panning on the horizontal plane becomes very important in establishing this sonic real estate. because it has this great ability and use in placing players and their sounds on the screen with great, great, great accuracy. We get very predictable results, which is, of course, what we want. So really, why does 3D spatialization become so difficult with two listeners? To better try to get you a chance to understand this, we'll look at an example here. So in this scenario, we have a view of our two players and their listeners. You can call them listener A and listener B. At any one time, these listeners will have their own relationship to the sounds in the world, which will never perfectly really align with one another. So when both of these listeners are mixing the same sound simultaneously, their perspectives are combined in a way where these two renditions of the same sound will clash with one another. Listener A and listener B combines in listener C, which is a perspective that doesn't render the truth for either of these two observers. Again, we needed to solve this issue. We needed a change in design here. And what we ended up doing was implementing our own behavior inside of the Wwise sound engine. And instead of what the previous example showed, here's the result of spatialization in our games, where final output equals attenuation based on whichever listener is closest to the source plus directionality based on whichever listener is looking at the source. And based on this formula, let's try to expand on our previous example. Here you can see both of our players with their listeners. The direction they are facing is shown by these cone shapes, and you can see a 3D spatialized emitter at the top of the screen. The red circle shows the attenuation range of sound. You can refer to the visual meters to the side and try to listen to how speaker placement is affected by our listener's relationship to the sound. Now, one listener is fully within attenuation range, and the sound is slightly to the right of them, so in a right speaker. But in just a moment, the second listener will also come to range. So the levels are now mostly balanced to be in the front due to the orientation of this new listener. This listener is now both the closest listener and the looking listener. So in this situation, you could almost say that we're seeing a more conventional single listener behavior when it comes to attenuation and spatialization. But there we saw a big change. The closest listener will still be the decider for attenuation, but it is not the same listener that is looking at the sound. The other listener is now further away, but since it's still looking straight at the sound, we will still keep that sound in our front speakers. But you can also notice from the meters that we also allow the signal to spread into our rear left speaker. And that is, of course, due to the position of the other listener, which is the closest listener. So now our distant listener is almost out of range, but our directions are very similar for our listeners. So the sound plays fully in front once again, with a slight left side offset due to the position of that closest listener. The closest listener turns away, which makes for another big change. Most of that signal is now in our rear speakers. However, the distant listener, which is still looking straight at the source, will make it so that we still allow some of that signal to remain in the front. Now we've gotten rid of two clashing truths. We have combined information from both listeners to create one final truth. So with this solution, we had once again established a framework for spatialization. But to succeed in creating and maintaining this sonic real estate that I've talked about, we needed to get an understanding on how to best utilize both 3D spatialization alongside 2D speaker pan sounds. And as we were mixing split fiction, we strongly felt that there was somewhere here a middle ground between these two techniques that we were missing. Of course, Wwise already offered us the option to blend these two perspectives, but we still felt that this approach was not quite what we were looking for. So instead, we introduced a new parameter, which we called spatial panning gain. Again, here is an example of spatialized sound. We can use the meters on screen to understand how the camera directions and how they change our speaker outputs to be either in front or in our backs. So spatial panning gain works by following what listener is close to the sound and allows its spatialized panning result to be offset to either the left or the right side of the mix, depending on which listener that is. And this speaker offset only really comes fully into play if the other listener is outside of attenuation range. And the mix will automatically move back to the default spatialized result if both listeners are present. And then, as one of the listeners again moves out of range, the offset from spatial panning gain is once more allowed to offset the mix to the side of the player that is still in range. Okay, so let's try to use this understanding now of an example of the same feature using spatial panning gain, but in a gameplay scenario where we expect to hear a crane on the left side of the mix and a large monster plant on the right side.
I've got a carnivorous-looking plant gazing at me.
What? Be careful.
Quite different. Let's see what happens when we introduce some spatial panning gain to this. to objects are now much more subtle. So let's look at an even more complex example as the players fight a massive boss. And here we have a very saturated mix example with sound effects, music, and VO playing in a very intense gameplay scenario. So now I would like to challenge everyone to use this new knowledge of how we solve all of these issues with multiple listeners and try to pick up on small things here and there to the mix.
Let's do a crash test. Road accidents happen daily.
This is a bit over the top.
I have had enough of you.
So in a second now, one of the players is about to leap onto the boss, and the players will be separated, tasked with solving different things in gameplay. So listen for how we use all of these techniques to maintain their sonic real estate during that section.
Stop resisting. Start dying, please.
Zoe, try to hit the eye. I'm trying. Oh, vengeance is awesome.
Your gears.
Here's another fun example. As one of the players dies, their side of the mix gets independently filtered and processed during that time. It's another powerful way for us to allow each player to really focus in on their own experience. Check it out.
I spy with my little eye.
So with that, let us move on to a different subject and another approach to handling our multiple listener perspectives. And the reason for this following feature stems from the fact that Split Fiction is a massively varied game with very rapid changes in gameplay. So rolling on screen here, you can just see a few of the types of different camera perspectives that players will transition in and out of during many different types of gameplay scenarios throughout the game. And we felt that these rapid changes in gameplay and camera brought on the need for our listeners to be able to change as well. And we needed new tools to allow ourselves to adapt listeners to any scenario. The solution was something that we call proxy emitters, a system for dynamic output bus routing. By allocating one of these proxy emitters to be a temporary listener output, we can create new submixes at runtime to process and adapt sounds to new circumstances in gameplay. So, the proxy emitter system is a way to handle dynamic routing of playing sound waves. But instead of functioning as an additive send, such as what you would normally use for, say, reverb, it is a complete reroute of all sounds playing through a specific emitter in the game, assigning them to an entirely new output bus in the master mixer hierarchy of Wwise. We use this tool as a way of reacting to these sudden changes in game to control attenuation, spatialization, or even add momentary DSP processing. And it allows us to keep using generic and shared sounds throughout different gameplay scenarios. An important feature of proxy mirrors is in the automated system that automatically crossfades all player sounds into a proxy.
So, how does this work? Do you know
Instead, this happens with the distance between the player and the camera crosses the
come
threshold.
again? Writing it and experiencing it is a totally different ballgame. Let's hope there's a plan to safely separate us and return me back to my story. I wouldn't bet on it. Just because you blew your shot to get published doesn't mean that I have to blow
Camera
mine.
comes back to
No, I think they're up to something fishy. I just don't know what yet.
smoothly crossfade back from the proximeter back into our normal output hierarchies, our default sound setting.
So, the inspiration for this story came from my family's love of hiking. Uh-huh. Have you ever been hiking, Mio? There are no mountains in the city. Huh. Ever been camping then? If you count tenting and music festivals, then
They can
sure.
change
That doesn't
settings for
count.
reverb, settings for attenuation, filtering volumes, whatever we want to adapt that sound to specific scenario. And of course, we can use these things for other tasks than just distance modeling in reverb. Sometimes we might use them to dynamically summix sounds with some extreme cool
Shape-shifting seems to come naturally to you.
It's humiliating. Let's try and think of something, anything positive with all of this. Well, my pollen allergy doesn't seem to trigger in here.
And again, this system will run automatically in the background, reacting to changes in camera distance. But we always have the option to assign custom proxy sets for custom scenarios. So a great amount of control there for us. So again, an example of proximeters being used in gameplay in spoon fiction. You can see from the text at the top of the screen when the system activates for each player. Green text means that the player is being routed through a proxy.
More of these frescoes. Don't let it escape! Hurry! In the name of the realm, stop!
So as you can see, this allows for a much more dynamic and adaptive approach to controlling attenuation and spatialization behavior for individual emitters. It provides runtime routing to situationally spatialized subjects. So it's time to start trying to summarize some of these concepts that we talked about today. And the easiest way for me to say that is that I believe that the listener is for audio what the camera is for gameplay, which means that, like the camera, the listener becomes the lens through which we experience game world sound. And when multiple of these lenses are involved, we must ensure that both players' perspectives are intertwined based on mutual truths, not exclusive ones. So let's try to close out this session with some final thoughts. Over the last years, the Hazelight audio team has found great success, I believe, in developing audio tools born and based on necessities made by sound design. In fact, I think we've been able to come up with our best responses in tech and design when we were faced with new limitations. And a statement that has been made is that we are not making games that sound fantastic despite being split screen. We make them sound great because they are split screen games. We can create frames of sound design that no other type of game can achieve. And in contrast to this earlier mentioned idea of the single listener, we've only really just begun to scratch the surface of what can be made possible when designing sound in multiple listeners. Our philosophies began to form in It Takes Two, and new ideas took split fiction to new heights. But there's just no telling what kind of new challenges would be found in similar titles in the future. There's no guide to follow, but instead, any developer could have great opportunity if they take risks and make something entirely new. 谢谢。Yes.
你好，就是对于技术音频设计师来说，可能比较关注的对于技术音频设计师来说，比较关注的一点就是我们在看到各位的那个演示的过程中，看到了 authoring 里面有关于一些自定义的一些属性，然后包括像那个panning 以及像 RDBC 里面开放了 RDBC 可绑定的那个 panning 的参数。这一块的话，应该是涉及到 authoring 的一个源码的问题。然后这个想了解一下，就是说，如果向Wwise官方申请这个 authoring 的源码的话，它后续的不管是包括结合我们项目的使用，还是到项目中的Sound Engine 的一个接入，这方面的经验有什么分享的吗？
Well, I'm sure that the good people of Enigk can tell you all about what you need to know about these sticks. But for us, it's been a road of using Wwise over 7 years now at Hazelight, and doing so with very specific requirements. And since we started using Wwise, we've had a great relationship with Enigk. I believe we've been in constant contact with them, discussing all of these ideas and philosophies that came into fruition with all of these techniques that we've shown here today. And as you might imagine, a lot of these things that was very, very important for us to succeed wasn't necessarily, didn't maybe make much sense in the grander scheme of things for Wwise. And of course, a very powerful facet of middleware like Wwise is that it's able to be used for any type of game engine, any type of game in any country in the world. So we of course knew that we couldn't expect them to really spend hours and hours and hours on features that maybe only ever made sense to our little studio in Stockholm. So the truth of it is that we've had very great collaboration with them, which has allowed us to add these features for ourselves. But at the end of the day, with what's in the box, packed with Wwise sound engine, will get you very, very, very far. And the first, I think the first step is always integrating Wwise as well as you can in whatever game engine you have, and then potentially look at how to further extend the capabilities of the sound engine. The authoring part of it becomes it's quite interesting to me when we look at the feature of, say, for example, the spatial panning game, which has a huge impact on the way we're able to fix the game. It's just one slider, and that slider is actually just controlling something that's already it's already there, the Wwise sound engine. It's all about exposing it to in a way that a sound designer can use it in a way that makes sense with all of these other concepts within Wwise. So I wouldn't say that the slider is not what you would start with, but maybe it is that last extra 1% of what you need. I hope that question makes, or that answer makes sense.
好，就是讲到这个双听者，我想问一下，在你们开发过程中有没有遇到过相位问题？就是两个听者他们之间发生了相位错开的问题。大概就这样。就是这里是提到了双听者，我是想问，在开发过程中有没有遇到过双听者相位发生错位的问题？
So if the question is about facing issues as in the face issues in sound, then yes, it is a very, very real problem, obviously. Sometimes not in the sense of when we're duplicating a signal, because those signals will obviously always be in phase, which is why we get the increase of 6 dB. But there, with the concept of having two players potentially performing two actions at the same time, if we would play the same sound asset for both of those players, and in fact playing two different instances of sound, then we very quickly run into phasing issues, which it certainly happens a lot during game development. And if you've ever played the game and heard something that you believe was a phasing issue during gameplay, I'm sorry that we missed it, but it is of course a very real issue with these types of games. But the easy way for us to fix it, and what we most oftentimes end up doing, is making unique assets per player. Say that both of the players are riding a motorbike vehicle. We will make a player A version of it and a player B version of it that might be similar, but not, they still have their own unique content, which immediately moves us away from the realm of having issues with sound phasing.
老师好，我想问一下，刚刚提到了一个参数叫 Spatial Painting Gain，我想问一下，它是我们在Wwise当中是自己去调整的，还是说它是有一个跟游戏中的某几个参数有关系，然后我们去自动的去调整这个参数呢？
Yes, so this property, which is the spatial pattern game, is implemented into Wwise in the same way as any other property in Wwise is, which means that we can decide if this property should be controlled by RTPC from gameplay. For instance, we don't have to statically set it. In fact, we very rarely do. So this means that we can set a default value with a slider for our objects in Wwise that will be baked and generated to the sound banks. But then we can also choose to hook it up to an RTPC. You could use a state or anything if you use that sort of setup, and then be able to control that, just as you would expect from any type of property in the ActiveX hierarchy. Oh, sorry, the container property. I'm not used to it yet. So yeah, that's the short answer. And Wwise with the new 2024 and also 2025 versions, they've also made it easier for users to add their own properties to these hierarchies as well, which is a great plus.
.大家可以看一下还有没有什么问题。
好像没有问题了，对吗？Hi, Joakim. Yeah, I think we have already answered all the questions. Thank you so much.